Hi, I'm Riley Tagliatela, and this is a little bit of clarity how an 18th century rhino named Clara became a European celebrity. This picture here is a painting by Pietro Lianghi. We will be examining this image to discover how and why the rhino at the center became a popular form of entertainment in the mid-18th century. The most important figure is obviously the rhino at the center. Her name is Clara, and she traveled throughout Europe, inspiring awe wherever she went. Clara toured Venice, Italy in 1751, which is when the Venetian partition Giovanni Girolamo Assibiri commissioned Pietro Lianghi for the painting. The leftmost figure is Clara's handler and owner, Van der Meer, a retired sailor for the Dutch East India Company. Clara was originally from India. She was not the first rhino to make it to Europe, but she was the first to live longer than a couple of years, and she was certainly first to garner the attention of so many people. Many have tried to hypothesize and answer the question of why and how Clara rose to fame. This presentation will argue that Clara's popularity came from three different components: an obsession with the performance of power, a fascination with the exotic, and Van der Meer's marketing and advertising, which appealed to both. All of these factors interlace to create a portrait of the rise of exoticism in 18th century Europe. Upon initial research, I discovered the rhino was indeed a celebrity, so much so that people wrote poems about her, made art depicting her, and created hairstyles that replicated her horn. The proof of such primary sources was difficult to come by, but I was able to find this poem by Ogden Nash. It states, "The rhino is a homely beast. For human eyes, he's not a feast. Farewell, farewell, you old rhinoceros. I'll stare at something less preposterous." And though this poem is short, it helps explain a little why Clara was a celebrity and helps prove that she was one. It showcases that Clara had enough of a fan base for someone to feel like writing and publishing this poem. It also tells us that people had never seen an animal like Clara before. Nash calls her preposterous, meaning Clara's form would have been crazy to look at. Clara was somewhat of an alien amongst the Europeans. While researching further into Clara, I stumbled upon articles and books relating to animal exhibits in general during the 18th and 17th century. Many of these papers did not mention Clara directly, though they did help me contextualize what the climate of the region was like during her grand tour, and they also gave me a clue into her rise to fame. They informed me that the European population at large had a growing interest in housing these foreign animals. One of the most popular forms of animal exhibits was menageries, which were prominent among the wealthy in London and the rest of the European mainland. Keeping these exotic animals was utilized as a way to demonstrate power and class. Italy, France, and England all had famous menageries at their cities' cultural centers. Menageries are the precursor to modern-day zoos. They were private gardens where wild and exotic animals were kept in exhibition and on display. Viewing and owning foreign beasts proved you had wealth while also giving the people who saw them a sense of power over the foreign animal, and to an extent, over the foreign country they originated from. King Louis XIV's menagerie at the Palace of Versailles is one of the most famous examples of a menagerie as a display of power. Peter Salins writes, "The king's taking possession of his realm was thus twofold and didactyl, representing at once a royal model of authority constructed through animals and aristocratic civility enacted in the observation of and interaction with strange and graceful creatures." Louis XIV was obsessed with displays of power, and his menagerie was a grand and expensive example of one of his techniques used to do so. Exotic animals showcased the king's power because they displayed ownership and control over wild beasts. King Louis is performing his power with the display of conquered exotic animals. The king even tried to buy Clara for his menagerie once, but deemed her selling price too expensive. Menageries point out control over the wild, and thus they point out a person's power. Salins also explains that it was classy to go and view these animals. It was an upper-class outing reserved for the elite. Clara's grand tour of Europe was no different. Seeing exotic animals gave people a sense of control over the natural world. When patrons went to see Clara, they were performing this power. If we return back to the image, we can see that the painting of Clara is both a direct dictation of power over nature, and it is also an object that shows class. When Giovanni Girolamo Assibiri commissioned Lianghi to paint Clara, it was fashionable for aristocrats to collect natural specimens and art, and this commission Giovanni is showcasing possession over both. Alexa Turchganovitz writes, the painting both documents the events of a rhinoceros in Carnival, as well as the interest in exotic animals. Therefore, the portrait allows the promotion of Giovanni as a collector of both art and natural objects. So the painting showcases Giovanni's status. It was commissioned to place Giovanni in a position of power and give him legitimacy as a member of the aristocracy. The painting of Clara takes place with the background of the Venetian Carnival. Venice during this era was becoming a popular tourist destination, and Clara was the perfect attraction for Carnival. Petroliani paints this scene in a fashion that demonstrates the festival's exotica in both animal and human form. Venice was a place for Europeans to let loose and see the different wonders of the world, and Clara was one of them in 1751. The women of Venice were also somewhat of a commodity to the other Europeans coming to visit Venice. The women in the painting are all wearing the customary Venetian masks, and they were beautiful, but just like Clara, only admired for their looks, and people neglected to see their true nature hidden beneath. As I touched on earlier, one of the other reasons Clara was so celebrated was because she was different. She was from a far-off land so divergent from Europe. Many of the Europeans that came to see Clara had probably never traveled any further than neighboring towns. To see an animal like Clara must have been awe-inspiring. In another poem I found written on a woodcutting depicting Clara, the author writes, "So wonderful is God, as seen in his creatures, that one finds everywhere Almighty's wise trace." So this is essentially saying that getting to see Clara was like getting a chance to see God's work up close. People fetishized and fantasized Clara. In this context, that means that they focused on her otherness to the point where she becomes otherworldly and impossible. They view her as a precious commodity and as a divine creature based on only her appearance and differentness. And Vandermeer had conquered her. Clara was now his piece of God's beauty to behold, display, and sell. Vandermeer profited off of people's fascination with other worlds. He caught on to the growing trend of stereotyping and commodifying the other, a trend that would become known as exoticism. Clara's fame created a huge business for Vandermeer, who not only profited from ticket sales, but also from the sales of souvenir posters and prints. Vandermeer knew his audience and knew the best way to market Clara. He heightened Clara's exoticism to highlight how Europe differed from the less developed country that Clara came from. His ads for her frequently noted how far she traveled, how wild those places were, and how big Clara was. In promoting these aspects of Clara, Vandermeer is selling her exotic nature and peculiarity. Vandermeer banked off of people's desires to feel control over the other and how they used Clara to do so. It is clear to see what Vandermeer is trying to accomplish with this poster advertising when and where he will tour Clara. There is no need to have the man in the background of this picture, but by including the topless, primitive-looking gentleman, it points out the fact that Clara comes from a wilder place. Vandermeer sensationalizes India and magnifies his patrons' expectations of India by making Clara seem more exotic, more dangerous. Author Michael Janis writes, exoticism reigns from stereotyping and cultural colonization and openness vis-a-vis the other. By having patrons gawk at Clara, Vandermeer was building a fascination and fantasy of the wild. Exotic animals brought over from Africa and India showcased European power over these places and helped build a sense of culture within themselves. In many ways, exoticism was a way to showcase how different Europe was from the rest of the world. The colonizing countries of Europe used exotic artifacts, objects, and animals to other the rest of the world from Europe. Author Benjamin Schmidt writes, Europe is defined not by any blunt imperial rule in the world, in other words, but by her association with geography and with the pleasures of exotica. The two, moreover, are inherently connected, in both global exotica and their pleasures coalescing around a freshly constituted idea of Europe. So Schmidt is explaining that Europe gained its identity through the othering and exoticism of the countries that they colonized. By looking at what they were not, European countries were able to discover who they were. When crowds of people came to visit Clara in Venice, they identified how their world was civilized and how they had power and control over nature, whereas the country that Clara came from, India, did not. Clara the Rhino had a fascinating career. She traveled throughout Europe and her popularity grew with her. A perfect mix of events caused Clara's strange claim to fame. Europe was in a state of flux and everyone was looking for ways to display their power. It was also a time of discovery for the world, and as the world got bigger, people strove to find out who they were by finding out who they were not, which took the form of exoticism. Pietro Liagni's painting of Clara beautifully encapsulates this perfect storm that led to Clara's stardom. Thank you so much. If you have any questions, please let me know. Here's my works cited page. Thank you.